knew soil carbon was, in a sense, the hub or central node of the circle of life, at least on land. And I knew that soil carbon was possible to measure fairly accurately, at least at a point. It's difficult to measure soil carbon or soil carbon change over a landscape or even a pasture or a field, but at a single location, it's possible to do that fairly accurately, and it was easier than measuring water, or so I thought. I knew that water was the big number one issue everywhere I went, and I've done carbon sampling and analysis all over North America. But I did find that management probably could make a difference, but it was noisy, it was highly variable. And then we had this big push to commodify soil carbon as an offset. And because my interest is in the carbon cycle, I realized that this was not right.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops that are grown in healthy soils and organic livestock that is raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from Peter Donovan. He's the founder of the Soil Carbon Coalition. We caught up with Peter earlier this year to learn more about his position against soil carbon trading offsets and credits. Instead, he advocates for increasing soil carbon primarily for its water holding capacity benefits, arguing that soil carbon sequestration through agricultural practices are too slow to be used as an offset for emissions. Let's dive into the details.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm talking today with Peter Donovan. I've known Peter for a number of years now. I think I first met Peter at a Walter Yana workshop. Peter has, I'm going to read this, has herded sheep and cattle and worked in the woods and on farms. And since 1996, he's reported on innovative natural resource stewards. In 1990s, he studied holistic management with Alan Savory, low-stress livestock handling with Bud Williams, and consensus building with Jeff Goebel and Bob Chadwick. 2007, he founded the Soil Carbon Coalition, and shortly afterwards embarked on the Soil Carbon Challenge. So I look forward to hearing about that. And a longtime resident of Northeast Oregon. Do you still live in a school bus?
No, I don't. I live in a small house now in La Grande, Oregon. And
wonderful. Good. I've seen that school bus. So can you, is the Soil Carbon Challenge something that's big in your life right now?
No, it was a chapter in my life. I was motivated by the question of, given that life is the most powerful geologic force, and that was realized over 100 years ago by Vladimir Vernadsky. The question to me has been, how can we work with this most powerful force? How can we work with the circle of life instead of what I perceive as, for many centuries and generations, we've tended to work against it?
Yes. Yes. It seems that the force that pushes people to work against it is usually economic.
Or survival, or the way people think they need to survive. And so I started measuring carbon. I knew soil carbon was, in a sense, the hub or central node of the circle of life, at least on land. And I knew that soil carbon was possible to measure fairly accurately, at least at a point. It's difficult to measure soil carbon or soil carbon change over a landscape or even a pasture or a field, but at a single location, it's possible to do that fairly accurately, and it was easier than measuring water, or so I thought. I knew that water was the big number one issue everywhere I went, and I've done carbon sampling and analysis all over North America, hundreds of places. But I did find that management probably could make a difference, but it was noisy, it was highly variable. And then we had this big push to commodify soil carbon as an offset. And because my interest is in the carbon cycle, I realized that this was not right. And that's one of the reasons why I've backed off of the soil carbon challenge work. Because the perception of carbon is that soil carbon is that it's some kind of offset to fossil fuel emissions. And if you look at the way the carbon cycle works, and I'm going to show a picture here, Dave, if that's okay.
Sure.
Can I share my screen?
Sure.
Okay, this is a very simplified picture of the carbon cycle. And on the left, we have lithospheric carbon going into the atmosphere, mainly as carbon dioxide from volcanoes and also from fossil fuel burning.
And I'm sorry, Peter, but just to slow it down, lithosphere means?
The crust of the earth.
Okay, thank you.
From the crust of the earth.
Yeah.
And then we have the two major flows or loops of carbon flow. On land, we have photosynthesis by plants taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then respiration, returning it back. And this is a very complex thing with heavy involvement by, of course, photosynthesizers and microbes. And there's a lot we don't know about that, or there's a huge variation in what people know and understand about that. But that's the basics of the process. The plants take in the carbon, it finds its way into the soil, and microbes do a lot of the respiration. And of course, fire and even our breath returns this carbon to the atmosphere, most of this carbon to the atmosphere.
Yes.
And then the other major loop is the solubility into the ocean. And this is mediated by Henry's Law of 1803, which states that the partial pressure of a gas above the liquid equilibrates with its dissolved concentration. And to put that in simple terms for most people, if we have a carbonated beverage, we know we can carbonate that beverage by pumping CO2 into the air above it and increasing the pressure of CO2. We can generate a carbonated beverage. But if we leave our glass of beer out on the counter, the carbon will move back into the atmosphere. The beer will go flat because there's not a very high concentration of carbon dioxide in the air above the beer compared to its dissolved concentration. So if we were able to take atmospheric CO2 into plants, trees, or rocks or soil, an almost equivalent amount would probably off gas from the ocean. And this is a known fact of physical chemistry, and there's mediating factors. It's complex. Again, the ocean is full of microbes, many of them photosynthesizers. And there's a lot of complexity there that we don't understand. But the basics of the physical chemistry is that the solubility of carbon dioxide depends on the concentration both of carbon dioxide in seawater and in the air. And so what this means is that the idea of carbon sequestration in soils is not a subtraction from the atmospheric pool, really, because the atmospheric pool of CO2 is connected to the oceanic pool. And there's more carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean than there is in soils and plants and in the atmosphere altogether. And there's a huge amount in there. And this has largely been ignored by many people, and because carbon sequestration is considered to be something we can sell. Instead, and this carbon cycle or circle of life is nested within much larger flows of solar energy, of the energy that warms our planet, that creates winds and currents, of the huge energy of the water cycle. And the carbon cycle, by contrast, uses just a pinhole's worth of sunlight, if you will, but it has transformative powers because it does lots of chemistry. And I'm not saying that soil carbon is worthless here. It has huge use value because it helps enable soils to accept and hold water. That's the big deal.
Yeah. Can I ask a question here, Peter? Basically, you're describing a system, as I understand it, with the ocean and the atmosphere and the plants and the soil, in which it's very hard to change the concentration of CO2 because the ocean will adapt to maintain an equilibrium. But we have increased the CO2 in the air, through a lot of burning of fossil fuel. So at least in the wrong way, it seems it is possible to change that balance. Did I get that right?
It is. It probably is possible, but the idea of drawdown or sequestration as a near-term subtraction of atmospheric carbon dioxide is not a thing.
Okay. Because the ocean will simply adjust the CO2 level. But
right.
what is a thing is to get more carbon, more organic matter in the soil, which will change the water cycle. I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you
Yes.
talk with me about why the water cycle, why that is so critical?
Because it's the major factor that enables us to eat. In the carbon cycle, photosynthesis, soil carbon, they have a critical impact on water cycling and the soil stability, soil aggregation. But it's the water that grows our crops.
Does this also have a lot to do with cooling and heating on the planet?
Yes, and you've been to Walter Yena's workshops. There's a tremendous amount there, and it's very complex, and there's lots of factors. But the water cycle is the elephant. The carbon cycle is the mouse that controls the elephant, if you will.
Yeah,
helps buffer the enormous power of water cycling, which we saw recently in Pakistan and again in many places around the world. The increase in intensity of the water cycle is a civilization crashing phenomenon.
Both in terms of increasing deserts, but then also on the other side, these Noah's Ark floods.
Right.
Yeah. So we get these wild swings in the water cycle, and it wreaks havoc on certainly on humans and on many other mammals as well.
Yeah. And the importance of soil carbon is that it can help buffer that potentially very destructive water cycle.
Yes. And as it does buffer that, then it helps to also moderate the temperatures.
Yes.
Okay. This is, this is a little bit deeper dive into climate science. So thank you.
And there's another way that we look at the carbon cycle, and this is the simplified version, where we have a simple balance measured in CO2 tons, and we have emissions on one side and so-called sequestration or drawdown on the other.
Yes.
And this makes this model or mental model of carbon cycling is quite popular, and it makes markets almost self-evident. Makes the market solution almost self-evident, given that with our governments we can't seem to put a limit on fossil fuel burning or reduce fossil fuel burning. Therefore, as Maggie Thatcher said, there is no alternative. We need markets.
Yeah. And
that's the sort of the neoliberal discourse that many of us have been formed by, particularly the younger generations.
Now, Peter, there's a lot of talk about, let's say, fraud in the carbon markets, and we'll talk about that. But you're saying, if I understand it right, that even in a legitimate carbon market in which you are paying for practices on land that actually is increasing the photosynthesis of that land, that's not sequestering more carbon, that's not going to make a difference why is this model wrong?
Because it ignores the ocean, for one thing. It ignores the complexity of the various microbial interactions that occur in different places on land and in different places in the sea. And it simplifies the carbon cycle to something that we can see as a problem. From the somewhat mysterious and very complex relationships and processes of the actual carbon cycle, this model gives us a path to a solution. I think it's a false path, but it appears to give us a path to a solution. In other words, we can not only gain a return, we can appear to solve a problem and appear to do good with this model. You see that?
Yes, I see that. And I would add that I believe that many of the people participating in this are not doing it cynically. They believe in the model.
Yeah.
They believe that they're doing good. So just, it's very easy to kind of point a finger and say, well, Cargill doesn't care, whatever. But my point is that many people who do care, people of great generosity of heart, believe in this model as well. And you're saying, that they're misled.
Yeah, and there are many well-intentioned people who have been persuaded to ask what I call the wrong question. How can we sequester carbon?
And what is the right question?
How can we work with the circle of life in all of its variability and complexity?
Okay.
That's the question that motivates me. And it's a complex, scary one, and there is no simple answer.
Peter, can you give me an example of something that is clearly not a solution, but that is seen as a solution, and then is something that you yourself would see as a solution? I mean, it's wonderful to say to work with the circle of life, but what would that look like? So first, what does it look like to sequester carbon in a way that is not working with the circle of life?
Well, for example, people ask me sometimes, because I'm considered some sort of expert on soil carbon, which I'm not. And they ask me, what's the best way to get more carbon into the ground? And what I routinely answer is, well, what I'd suggest is disking 10 tons of disking 10 tons of coal dust per acre. That will increase your carbon.
Yes.
but it does very little for the circle of life, if you will.
Yeah. And
that's but don't get me wrong, soil organic carbon is wonderful stuff. It enables soil aggregation, enables the soil to accept and hold water to a much greater extent. But it's not a linear thing. It's not a simple thing. And by working with the circle of life, I mean, we get actual feedback on what's happening. And this is difficult because we're used to just proceeding with the favored solution and not paying attention to the results. And the results might include economic factors, production per unit of input, for example, or in the arid West, for example, per inch of rain. That's one. How well does your soil accept and hold water? Those are very good questions. And are you achieving change over time with whatever you're doing? And management of complexity, as we know, is adaptive. Needs feedback, needs high quality feedback. And the people that I know who have done the most with this are all self-motivated. They're not typically externally motivated by some sort of payment or incentive.
Yes.
And that's why so many of our federal programs, or the whole idea of climate smart agriculture, I think is a sham. And I would say that carbon sequestration or carbon markets is a shell game because we don't know whether the carbon is in the air or the sea or the land. And it's a scam on several levels because there is so much fraud, there's so much incentive for fraud, and it's not usually very well measured or tracked.
So, as I listen to you, I hear that the way the problem would present, say, a vegetable farmer in New England, would be quite different from how it would present to a grain farmer in Montana, where in Montana they really have no water, and the little water they get is hugely precious. And in New England, typically we have abundant water, and it's just a different problem. We all face consequences of climate change. That's going to affect everyone. It will be most painful in dry areas, most immediately painful. Then everybody in dry areas will try and go where it isn't so dry, and everyone gets to share the problem. Do you think, I hear what you say, that the people who are working on genuine solutions, by and large, are not motivated by a financial program. They're motivated by a vision of doing things better, of being more in tune with the circle of life. What would that look like to do something? And I don't care, you could choose New England or you could choose Montana. What would it look like to farm in a way that was more in sympathy and conjunction and in alliance with the circle of life?
Well, in Montana, for example, it would probably lean toward diverse perennial pastures.
Okay.
And again, lean toward the management of those that promote diversity, that promote good growth, and sometimes a little higher stock density than a lot of people use, and maybe longer recovery periods.
Mm-hmm.
For example, that's what it would might look like in Montana.
And what might it look like in New England, in your opinion?
Well, again, diverse perennial pastures, that's not, for example, historically what Vermont had. but food farms in the forest might be one example, and diverse perennial pastures with value-added production, like Butterworks Farm, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. In both cases, you've described livestock farms.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like to eat bread and broccoli too. Is that part of a vision?
Yeah, and obviously, there's many people who are growing vegetables and grains in ways that are far more friendly than huge monocultures that we see in the Midwest, for example. But I don't get mixed up with labels, because even labeling a practice is problematic. What is grazing? What is no-till? Sometimes it's easier to say what it's not, or something, if we want to apply a label. But in general, I try to avoid the minefield of labels.
Yes. I just will say that, in my opinion, the Real Organic Project is actually not about building a label. It's about building a movement. And there are many farms that I greatly respect who are not certified with us or with anybody. And I still respect them. And there are, of course, farms that are certified with the USDA as organic that I do not respect. So, I agree that, I think that there's a need for labels in the world, because most people don't know they're farmers. But yeah, it's complicated, just like everything. It's complicated. So I'm more interested right now in figuring out what kind of farming do we want. And then, one of the things that in the drawing of the teeter-totter of emissions and sequestration and drawdown, and you're saying that, ultimately this is not a real solution, that this model, which is now becoming hugely funded by our government and taking our tax money to pump billions of dollars into this model. And I will say that I think most of that money is being spent fraudulently. It's not even real sequestration and drawdown, but that's a different conversation. But I think that citizens, are very confused about what is it that we want to encourage. Is it possible for our government to help move us towards this solution? One of the things I've seen with regenerative agriculture, just for example, so did organic as a small farmer movement. And right now, regenerative has exploded into becoming a corporate movement. And I think people are genuinely confused. Well, do we want to try and get these huge corporations to try and do better, because they have such huge influence over what happens next? And, I have my opinion, and everyone has their opinion. But what do you think? What should we as citizens be working towards? What do we go, this is a solution that we think will lead to the outcome that we want?
Well, with federal policy, I think it's very difficult. I haven't been very involved in any kind of federal policy movements. Our nonprofit is not really focused on that. There are quite a few that do, but the limitations of federal policy are huge, because, as I said, most of the people who really want to farm with nature, work with the carbon cycle and so forth, are self-motivated. And often, if we apply an external motivation, that can become a perverse incentive, or it is easily gained, or something that we know like that, especially if you pin the program to practices rather than outcomes or results. because practices vary enormously depending. And we think that, no-till is one thing or grazing is one thing, and no, it's not. When you get out and actually see what people are doing, it's incredibly varied.
Yeah.
But the biggest low-hanging fruit for federal policy, I think, is to dispense with certain policies that are against working with nature. For example, let's drop crop insurance, or let's drop climate smart agriculture, or the whole net zero thing, or any of that. There's many organizations that have been claiming this for a long time, in particular the Indigenous Environmental Network. Out of Bemidji, Minnesota. They've got some great resources on how climate smart agriculture is an appendage of its colonialism 3.0 or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's hierarchical, hegemonic, however you want to call it. So that's the opportunity with federal policies, to eliminate perverse incentives, and I think that's going to be difficult to do without a mass popular movement.
Yes, and it's it's a challenge to get a mass popular movement, because I think you described data as being very noisy, and I'd like to hear you talk about that. But what I've seen is that the conversations are very noisy. And I mean, climate smart agriculture is a perfect example. Gosh, that sounds good. I'd like to see an agriculture that was climate smart, meaning apparently that it was an agriculture that was going to move towards healing a wound and repairing a cycle that is being degraded and degenerated. And yet that doesn't appear to be what climate smart means, is it? They always choose words that sound so good and aren't so good.
Well, this is part of it's part of a broader policy where Vilsack and the USDA and the Iowa Axis and Monsanto and Bayer and everything, they want more private investment in agriculture, which, as you know, goes mainly to the input sector when it occurs. And they want government to de-risk it in the same way that Daniela Gabor, with her paper, The Wall Street Consensus, a lot of Big Green and, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, they tend to want to play along with this. And let's use government to de-risk the entry of private capital into various markets, like carbon markets. And the USDA wants to standardize those, wants to increase the quality and so forth, to what is basically a shell game.
So do you believe that the carbon markets as such are unsalvageable? It's like, that's really not the way to go?
I do believe that, yeah. Because it's fundamentally a deception that we can reduce atmospheric CO2 by drawdown or sequestration. And as you know, it excuses the continued high level of emissions. But this is, again, not to say that more soil carbon isn't a very good thing for the people who live on the land. It has high use value. But the exchange value that we're putting on it via these markets is fraudulent, I think.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to sell a partially imaginary exchange value, it requires complicated packaging.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things, I think it was Elliot Coleman who said, somewhere in all this, everyone seemed to forget that agriculture was actually about growing food. And, so agriculture is coming to be depicted as a way of sequestering carbon, and that's the purpose of it. And of course, whether it does or not is a whole different question. You said that it's important to measure results, not just to reward a system of farming, but to measure the results and reward that. But I've also basically heard you say the results are very hard to measure. That you can measure it in one spot over time, but you move 10 feet over and things get very different, and you move 6 inches deeper and things get very different. So tell me about that.
Well, I believe the policy opportunity to go back to your policy question, the policy opportunity is for local movements, not national ones. I think there's a necessary national or international connection there, but the primary activity has to be local, because that's where the variation is, that's where the adaptability is, that's where the human relationships are, that's where there's a much better chance of building trust and building or growing feedback loops, about outcomes and results that are very relevant to the people working on that land. And that's, your level of soil organic matter or carbon or something like that might be a sort of a national standard, but that's meaningless. As we know, there's, if you're farming on peat soils in California Delta versus sand in New Mexico or something like that, a very, very different type of operation. And these results, these outcomes have to be relevant locally. And I don't think they can be standardized across the whole country or anything like that, which makes top-down policy problematic for soils problematic.
Yes.
Or labels or specification practices problematic.
Yeah.
Because we're complex, highly variable systems where we don't understand everything.
So here we get to Al Gore's statement that it's important to change the light bulbs, but it's more important to change the laws. And I think that the purpose of that is to say that there's tremendous leverage in making a systemic change. And I've heard the same thing about people talking about in racial justice. It's very nice to have neighbors who don't hate you because of the color of your skin, but what we'd really like to do is change the economic opportunities for people so that they can thrive and survive and thrive. And those barriers are often institutional and not personal. And I'm just curious, because I hear what you're saying, and I agree, and I look around and the solutions I see are actually coming from people I can name rather than from government organizations or large national outfits. But how do we wrap our heads around that? I mean, I know that you're someone who's working very hard on a vision of a better agriculture, better for everybody. That's something that will sustain the land, sustain the people. How do we move forward? Do we surrender the big ship to the pirates and we say we're going to go off in the lifeboats? How do you think about that?
Well, as I mentioned, I think in terms of federal policy, soils are a difficult thing to deal with, but we could do some very good things if we had a mass popular movement to dispense with crop insurance, to dispense with climate smart agriculture, for example, these national standards. the Vermont working group recently came up with a recommendation that the state of Vermont enhance the conservation stewardship program, make it easier and better. That's a step in the right direction, I think, but the real step is locally, which is not a federal policy for soils. However, to control emissions, I do think federal action is necessary. And again, that needs to be a mass popular movement.
Yeah. Well,
but to husband our soils is a local task.
It's gotten complicated where I think we're down to maybe 2% of Americans are farmers, and the other 90% are presumably eating food grown by those 2%. So most people are fairly removed from how their food is grown. Somehow we need to build an alliance between eaters and farmers. And even on a local level, that's not easy. We know that. Vermont, which is relatively a glorious model of organic agriculture in America, and yet I don't know what percentage of the food eaten in Vermont is grown in Vermont, but it's very small.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking at systemic change, we have a long way to go. Can I ask you, you consider kind of one of the top priorities on a federal level to drop climate smart agriculture, and they just got awarded $3.1 billion. And I know one person who is a big advocate in this, and I'm sure they got a little bit of that 3.1 billion, but they're an organic nonprofit, and they said, well, we don't support where all that money went, but we do support, at least the government is now talking about soil health and the relationship between climate and agriculture. Do you think there's any truth to that? I know that, for example, in soil health, 20 years ago, I would say the only people talking about soil health were people in the organic movement. And, that started back in the 1930s, I think, talking about living soil. And now it's become a standard talking point for Bayer Monsanto and Syngenta. And we go, gracious, what's going on here? So clearly those forces have occupied the climate smart agriculture movement, which they to some degree invented. What do we do about that? Do we need a cry of outrage about how this money is being spent?
I don't know. It would be interesting to see how it is being spent, and I think people in various levels have some leverage on this. I think many of the recipients of the climate smart commodities money already are being steered away from sometimes their primary purposes to meet the deliverables of these grants. Again, focus on greenhouse gases, and of which water vapor is not considered to be one of them. Mm-hmm. And as we know, it's the greatest greenhouse gas in terms of its heat trapping effects. But no, our culture is one of solutioneering, typically around the wrong questions. And this question is, how can we enlist agriculture into a market system that rewards the false idea of carbon sequestration? And it might have some good effects. Some people who might be treating their soil a little better if they get some of this money. I'm not saying that it's bad in all cases. but I think there's far better ways to do this. And I think conservation districts potentially could have a much bigger role in the United States because they're local, or at least have got the basics of democracy. And as FDR wrote in the letter to the governors in 1937, in which he said, "The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself," he also said that this idea of conservation districts is imperative because it will enable farmers to cooperate.
Yeah.
And that task, I think, has been abandoned by many soil and water conservation districts across the country in favor of administering federal programs or other federal programs and stuff. But to pay attention to our soil and water and to enable farmers and citizens to cooperate to create deep topsoil watersheds is still available.
Okay.
And the federal government could help by that, in part by getting out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
With these huge amounts of money that will probably end up being a perverse incentive for working with the circle of life.
Yeah. Yeah. Peter, could I ask you a couple questions? I've heard from people I respect two fairly different versions of how much of the products of photosynthesis are exuded through the roots into the soil and used as something exchanged with the life in the soil in exchange for minerals. And one person whom I look on as a teacher has said 30 to 50% of the products of photosynthesis are exuded out of the roots, and another person whom I greatly respect said it's 1 to 3%. And then if a plant was exuding 30 to 50%, you would create a zone around the roots in which there was no oxygen left. It would kill everything. So I'm curious, do you have an opinion on that from your research and your understanding?
No, I don't. And we typically take various assessments or measurements that are done once or twice in certain places to apply to the whole world. And as far as I know, that's not the way the carbon cycle works.
That which is not the way the carbon cycle works.
Right. In other words, that one measurement in the southwest corner of North Dakota is not gonna be true for everything.
Right.
And the best way I know of to do this is to use infiltration rings and time an amount of time it takes for, say, an inch of water to soak into the soil inside a confined infiltration ring that's driven into the soil partway.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that a foot away or 2 feet away or 6 feet away and stuff, and people understand the variability there as in a hands-on way.
Yes. And what would be an example of what you might learn from that?
That all sorts of things might make a difference. There's this clump of bunch grass here. There's this cow pie with all sorts of organisms working underneath of it, create macropores that allow water infiltration. There's these different plants that grow here, or there's this different kind of soil cover or different kind of history. And the one thing that I've learned is that it's very variable. The variability is extremely high.
Uh-huh.
And that it's like, I hear people saying, oh, my farm is such and such, is 4% organic matter. And, that's like saying, to me, that's like saying that the pH of an aircraft carrier is 6.5. That if you grind up the whole thing and tested it, it would be this. And that's just not the way I think the system works. So it's very likely that somebody has done an assessment and measured 1 to 3% of exudates going into the soil, another 30 to 50. They could both be right.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Would most of the organic matter that is a result of the photosynthesis, would that be stored as plant matter, or would that be stored as microbes living in the soil? I mean, the plant itself is doing most of the photosynthesis. I guess there are microbes that will also photosynthesize.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. That's
There's a lot of mystery in this area here.
The microbes, yeah.
And there's, some of the dissolved carbon will go into the sea from rivers and so forth.
Yeah.
Some of the carbon in the ocean will be deposited as sediments in terms of, shells or tests of small organisms that will eventually move into the lithospheric carbon cycle and so forth. There's a lot of complexity here, but we want a solution here. We would much prefer this picture to work with, because that fits our programs, fits our mentality, fits our sense of doing good, our ability to do good. But this will probably not help us learn to manage complexity.
Yeah.
As Oliver Wendell Holmes supposedly said, I would not give a fig for the simplicity on the near side of complexity, but I would give my right arm for the simplicity on the far side of complexity.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think this is still on the near side here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we are paying billions of dollars for it, as you mentioned. We're devoting billions of dollars to making this market smoother and less wrinkly.
Yes. So your suggestion, your proposal, your advice to both farmers and eaters who are concerned and who understand that certainly we do face a problem as a result of our choices, and I mean by humans' choices over the last 500 years, and those choices are getting more and more amped up. That there are actions that would be helpful, but a massive carbon credit program is not one of them.
Right.
And the climate smart agriculture movement is not one of them.
Yeah, soil carbon has tremendous value to all sectors of society, but helping to remove atmospheric carbon dioxide is not one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or to offset emissions is not one of them.
Right. The first thing with emissions is to stop making them. And
yeah.
Peter, another thing that I hear, and it's confusing to me, is some people talk a lot about moving soil towards fungal dominance, and other soil mycologists say that's crazy talk. And there's fungi in tilled soil, there's fungi in non-tilled soil, there are different species. That there's a lot. It's a lot more complicated than that. I'm just curious. Do you go? Well, what's your response to that claim that when you move a soil towards fungal dominance, you're creating something that it's going to be more healthy and produce crops that provide greater health for those that eat them?
Yeah, I've also heard a lot about that, and I've seen run various analyses on the PLFA or the microbiometer kind of biological tests, and sometimes I don't see a very much of a correlation between the production I see above the ground and what the soil analysis tells me below the ground. But I'm sort of agnostic about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of very expensive tests that people run that I'm not sure what they show or what value they are to the farmer or rancher.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a huge business in various inoculants now. And I'm not saying I'm against that, but try something, but make sure it's a safe to fail trial.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And see what results you can detect.
I interviewed farmers who are working with Chico State and Davis on, this is organic low-till out in California. And it's not no-till, it's vegetable farming. And what they've done is they're on a bed system, and they'll flail the bed, they'll flail the cover crop, and then they'll use discs to open up a 10-inch basically tilled bed in the middle of it, and the rest of the soil is undisturbed, and they'll plant in that. And the outcome has been surprising, and for the farmers doing it, disappointing. They saw about approximately a 10% reduction in yield, and these are people who are very good at keeping records, a lot better than a lot of us. And so they toured me around, and these were fairly large trials. I mean, many acres of trials. And indeed, you could see in the low till that the crop was less verdant and less luxurious than in the one where they had tilled the full bed. And I said, why is that? It actually didn't make any logical sense to me. And they said, we think that in our dry climate, when we flail the green manure, it just sits on the surface and it doesn't break down very quickly. Whereas when we till it in, it provides the fertility for the next crop. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And, I haven't seen the results from Chico yet. It's possible that the full till actually has higher soil organic matter than the low till, because they're incorporating that organic matter, and it breaks down. I've certainly heard of farms out there that have higher organic matter in their growing fields than they do in their windrows, in the fence rows where the soil's never disturbed. So I'm rethinking a lot of things here, and I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around it. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I think it's great that people try things and keep tabs on the results and chew those over for at least a period of several years. And I know the Full Belly Farms. I know the people there. They're doing that, and likewise Brian and Scott Park and
that's who I'm talking about. Yeah, and Phil Foster. Yeah,
Phil Foster. Yeah,
great farmers.
Yes, great farmers, and they have the interest to learn from what they're doing. Yeah, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, it's a gift for all of us to see what happens when somebody who's, one of the problems with a lot of government tests is that I don't trust the people running the tests. I don't mean that they're lying. I just mean that they don't necessarily know how to farm. And I certainly trust these people, that they're excellent farmers. And so the tests are pretty meaningful.
Yeah.
Peter, before we go, I'm curious, one of the things that gets thrown in my face occasionally is that article in Nature back in the day that said that organic farming is of course worse for the climate than chemical farming because it has a lower yield per acre, and as a result, you have to have more acres. And as a result, that's taking land out of forest. And there's something about that that seems so perverse to me. I know what's involved in chemical farming, and it's not a good thing. And, there's something wrong in the thinking there to me. And one of the things, of course, is that a lot of organic farming, the fertility is based on growing the fertility. And so the green manure is not producing a crop, but it's counted as part of the cropland. So it makes it look like it's less efficient per acre because they're growing their fertility there. You have any thoughts about that?
Well, I might step back a little bit with one of the questions. As humans, we're addicted to judgment. We're committed to judgment. We judge ourselves. We judge other people. We judge species. We judge practices as good or bad. And maybe if you're a 40-year Buddhist monk or something, you can get beyond that. But most of us are still trapped in the need for judgment because we're social creatures. But we can add a question to the judgment question. For example, we often ask, is something good or bad? In my county in Northeast Oregon, in the 1920s, wolves were bad and cows were good. In the 1990s, there was a certain population who thought the opposite, that wolves were good and cows were bad. And we've had these flip-flops too about dietary fat, about various health things. Coffee or alcohol is good or bad for you, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, if you want to follow the news on that. But probably a better question in this case is, how does it function in the larger system or the larger context? And that's a learning question that we can add to the judgment question. But often we just stop at judgment. We don't want to find out actually how something works. And that's where the feedback loop comes in. And likewise, we ask a question, am I doing the right thing, or is this organization or is the federal government doing the right thing? And a better question might be, what are the results they're getting? If we really want to manage complexity, we need to pay attention to results and how things function in larger systems. And that's why I point to the larger view of the carbon cycle that is nested within and our self-awareness and consciousness are part of that. Those faculties are driven by the energy from photosynthesis. We're looking at the carbon cycle from inside it, if you will. Looking at the water cycle from inside it. And so I think, rather than trying to say that this or that is good or bad, how does it function in the system? What are the results we're getting? And those are hard questions. They require evidence that's relevant and timely and appropriate. And we don't always get those.
Yes. Yeah. Peter, we should end. Is there any last thing you would like to say?
No.
Good. Peter Donovan, thank you so much. It's really been a privilege to talk to you about this stuff, and I will be thinking about it for a while. So thank you for talking today.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We are so grateful to those of you who subscribe and share the link with your friends who want to learn more about good food, the food system, and all the issues that we discuss. As always, a video version of this interview is found at realorganicproject.org and by following our YouTube channel. Please join us next time when our guest will be farmer Mark Kimball and his wife and author, Kristen Kimball, author of one of my favorite books, The Dirty Life. They operate Essex Farm in upstate New York, and Kristen is going to be a speaker at our upcoming in-person Churchtown Dairy Conference on October 14th in Hudson, New York. Tickets are on sale on our website. We hope to see you there.